Okay, it's pretty late, but I figure I'll go ahead and make it anyway. So, what I want to do is I made a video on should you pay for audio engineering school, right? And I think, yeah, definitely school is worth it if the price is reasonable. The problem is most schools are not reasonable. Most schools have turned into money greedy, profiting. That's generally what it is. They've turned into, these basically for-profit, greedy. Not all of them, but like, for example, Full Sail, which is ridiculous, a 4-year degree. What I can teach you in 2 weeks, what you would learn at an audio engineering school in 4 years, I can teach you in 2 weeks. And I'm going to do a series of videos, basically, because after that, everything else is just going to come with experience and just doing it and gaining experience as you do it. It's the only way you're going to learn is you have to do it. You have to practice what you learn and you keep applying what you learn, you get better at it. So what I want to start with in this video 1, 2 weeks, is I'm going to talk about basically there's there are basically 7 fundamentals other than the space, other than all the technical stuff like floating rooms, room within rooms, wiring, the acoustics of a live room, and things like that. That's going to be taught literally in a day. But I want to talk about the 7 things, which would be microphones, which I'm not going to talk about microphones today. Then you're going to talk about the actual, I'm going to talk about a console, because the console is mixing all sounds and signals into one master. That's the purpose of a console, pretty much, is to mix every sound that you got going on into one cohesive two channel, 2 stereo mix or whatever, the final 2 stereo output that you would hear coming out of your speakers, that people will listen to. People listen to a 2 stereo track master copy. That's what pretty much anyone's listening to is a final master copy. So the mixer, that's the point of the mixer. And then other than that, I'm just going to talk about really 5 key components of all this, which would be the preamp, the EQ, dynamics, which means you're talking about compressors and gates, expanders, reverb units, and delays. So what I want to do is I want to correlate. You hear this term the console, then you hear this term outboard gear, because really in a recording console there's generally a recording device to record everything to, which would be a tape machine. But in this case, we're using the DAW as the tape machine. Your Pro Tools or your Reaper or your Logic Pro or your Cakewalk or your Ableton Live or whatever DAW that you're using, I call them VRSs, that's your tape machine. The thing is, the one thing that you need for your tape machine is, I hope this don't, let me see, this look like it's got some smudges on it. Oh, I should have cleaned that off. So, okay. So, the one thing in your that you need for your tape machine on your PC or Mac, meaning your DAW, you just need an interface so the interface can talk to the computer. So that's something that you have to choose. And you have to depend on what interface you choose is basically depending on how many channels that you need to record into your tape machine / your DAW / your VRS at a time. Some people need to only record 1 or 2 things at a time. Some people need to multi-track and record 16 things at a time. Some people need 24, and so it varies. And your inputs into how many do you need? How many outputs of signal coming out of your tape machine do you need? The old system with the inputs and outputs, like if you had a 24-track tape machine, would mean that it had 24 inputs and it had 24 outputs. 24 signals going into the tape to record to it. 24 outputs are coming out of the tape to record to it. So you just need an interface. If you want to do 24 inputs and outputs at the same time, you just have to buy an interface that can do that many inputs and outputs. So other than the preamp, which means you need to pre-amplify a signal, mostly mic signals for the most part, because those are the signals that need to be pre-amplified to a recordable sound, right? So the preamp. Other than that, there would be, an EQ to equalize out frequencies. That's the whole point of frequency. Sometimes you have to boost, sometimes you have to cut. And then there would be dynamics. So dynamics would be, that's controlling volume. A compressor is nothing but a peak volume controller. You're controlling the peaks, for loudness. There's something that might get too loud at certain points. You want to put a peak controller on it. And sometimes you might have to limit the max amount of volume. We call them limiters. Things like that. Other than that, you have what they call effect units that create these effects. They're psychological effects like space and sound, delays and vibrations and room things happening within the room. You use that with reverbs and delays. And then there's other special types of effects that you might want to add to create psychological effects to the sound. So those are generally the tools. So what I want to do is you hear this term outboard gear. This is gear that will be out of a mixing board. They would call it a mixing board. So all the stuff that would be in the mixing board, meaning there's preamps in the mixing board. Some don't have preamps, but a lot of mixing boards have preamps. We call them consoles or desk or boards. It's the same thing. The mixing board will usually contain your preamp. Then maybe it's going to contain an equalizer to equalize frequencies. And then there's usually a routing section to route to different parts of the board, meaning some auxiliary outputs, some auxiliary sends to a master auxiliary send to come out of the board, then come back into the board, an insert and a send and a return. That's why they call them sends and returns. The send out and then come back to the board to create an auxiliary. And then there's buses where you can take a bunch of sounds together and group them into one bus of sound. Another one, so that's why you have buses. Other than that, some boards would have direct out to come directing the record out into something else. You might want to send the sound out. So your board, a mixing board, that's generally a mixing board. Now some boards have more stuff on a particular channel than others, but every channel is identical. So you're looking at channel. Well, when you see a piece of gear like a preamp, it might just be a preamp. It could be a channel strip, meaning that it's going to be an EQ, a preamp and an EQ, or it might be a preamp, EQ, and compressor. Now, some mixing consoles come with preamps, EQs, and compressors, dynamics. Like an SSL, for example, they usually have those. A lot of other mixing boards don't have dynamics, like older Neve consoles or some API consoles, or like this Allen Heath. They don't have a dynamics in them, so you would have to insert some dynamics on a channel or a bus group. Bus or group, same terminology. So the term inboard being anything that's not that would be in a mixing board would be out of a mixing board, terming outboard gear. So that's where you hear that term. So a lot of times you're going to get different companies that would have different outboard gear that would not come in this board, that would not come in your mixing board. So you have to get some outboard gear to use to mix into the board. So the ideal is so you can use that stuff that wouldn't be in the board. Like most boards are going to have at least the preamp, EQ, but you might want a different sound. So you're going to hear, sometimes you can hear, this is the reason why sometimes you can go into somebody's studio and they don't have a mixing board or a mixing console or a mixing desk, because they only need one channel of flavor from a particular board. Like this is Allen Heath. And so a lot of companies started making their own preamps, or they start making their own outboard gear preamps or preamps with EQs on it, or they start making some of their outboard gear with their own preamps, EQs, and compressors. So that's the general idea. So you're going to see, and then it started becoming hundreds of companies start making outboard gear to give engineers, mixing engineers that would run a mixing board. They would give mixing board engineers options. So that's what you were doing. Is like, well, maybe you may not like the preamp of a particular mixing board that you bought. So you might want to use a different preamp just to change the sound of that preamp. Or you might not want to use the equalizer on the mixing board. You might want to use a different flavor type of EQ on the mixer board. Or you might want to blend stuff. So one thing that when it comes to gear, this is where you're going to start to see similarities in outboard gear and a console. This is where they're all generally laid out the same way. And I'll give you some examples. So what I'm saying is this. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at a channel, right? Let's say you bought a preamp. One thing that you're going to see on a preamp on a console like this one, and a preamp in like maybe say a preamp and an external piece of preamp gear that you might bought. One thing that you will see is it will be laid out that the functions are going to be generally the same. So basically in the preamp section on this channel, minus when you have outboard gear, outboard meaning out of a mixing board gear, you're not going to have auxiliaries and bus routing controls like you would on a console, like most mixing consoles with multiple channels. So a channel strip like these are basically a strip version of a channel that would be in a mixing board. So because of that, that's why they're called channel strips. When they're not just preamps like these particular preamp outboard only are just preamps only, just like that. That's a preamp only. That's a preamp only. That's a preamp only. This tone beast is a preamp only. This blue tube is a preamp only. So the similarities between those pieces of gear that are just preamps only would be the same as if you had a preamp but it's just a really, really small section on this board. But it's just a preamp only in this part of the channel, the preamp section. And most of the time, what you'll notice is you will have your gain control. You're going to usually have a high pass filter, maybe a 48 volt to engage, 48 volts for a condenser microphone. Dynamics and ribbons do not need that. Some, unless it's specified that might need phantom volt power. Other than that, and then you would have maybe the polarity reverse, the reverse the voltage to cancel. If microphones are canceling each other out, you can reverse the polarity so they don't cancel each other out. Other than that, you're going to have the master control output of that channel. So like, for example, I was demonstrating, for example, channels 21 here, or any of them. It doesn't matter because they're all identical. So you have your preamp, and then you have the master, the gain input coming from your source. So if you plug something into the preamp of that channel, you're going to have the gain control volume for that input. So you can hear, you have to adjust your gain input so you can hear whatever source that you're putting into that channel. That's your volume control for it. And then on the console, to hear the output will be at the fader here. So how does this correlate with an outboard gear? It would be the same thing. Okay? It's just a matter of where they put the input and the output. For example, I'll use on a let's use this Pro MPA. This one particular section would be the exact same kind of preamp section that would be on a console. The preamp section, you would have the gain input to listen to what, how much gain coming in on that channel, and then the output would be at the fader. Instead of having a actual sliding fader, you just got a knob on an outboard piece of gear. They hardly ever put faders on outboard gear. So that's the same thing. Then it's going to give you options like a high pass filter. You're going to have some buttons that are going to correlate to that piece of gear, like 48 volt phantom power and things like that. It's the same thing. If like on this Avalon, you have a preamp section. You got your gain input. That's your gain input. What type of source? Is it a mic or whatever? High pass filter. Allowing to apply 48 volt power and so forth. A lot of times there are more options. I'll talk about other features on these channel strips later. But that's the same thing when you're looking at any preamp. You're looking at, and most of the time, some of these outboard gear will give you a few more options that may or may not be on the consoles. Now, some consoles will give you pretty much, depending on the console, it will pretty much give you the same options like you would on an outboard piece of gear. Some consoles give you those kind of options. This one, it doesn't have as many options, but that's generally the same thing. And then it also gives you an option like here, you got line. You push it up, it leads in the mic. Push it in, it means the line. On a piece of outboard gear, it's the same thing. You would have switch it to line, or you could switch it to mic. And that's how they correlate. The two correlate. So the same thing you have, like on this particular preamp, you have the same thing. You got your master volume input, and it gives you option to engage 48 volts. You can leave it out for mic or push it in for line, a padding, and then a lot of times they'll give you like phase. You can reverse the phase like you would on here. You can reverse the polarity or phase. Or you're talking about, because this has an EQ, you can engage the EQ, just like on here on the console. Here's your EQ section. You can engage the EQ. If it has, so Like this does, because this is just a preamp, they're not going to have an EQ on this one, or this one, or that one, or this one, or this one. They don't have preamps. They're just preamps only, so they don't have EQs. And when they're just a preamp, they're just a preamp outboard gear. Once they start give you options to put an EQ and a compressor, then it becomes a channel strip and not just a single outboard preamp. And that's the similarities between here. Other than that, you're just gonna, on a console, you're just gonna have out auxiliary routings to take that channel and send it to different parts of the board with auxiliaries routing and bus assignment routings. Other than that, on an outboard piece of gear, you're not going to have, you usually won't have mute solo. You might have bypass, but you're not going to have mute and solo and panning, because you would have that on the console simply because it gives you the options to send that channel to the output section of the output for what you're listening to. And because outboard pieces of gear are single sources, it's not needed to have panning or solo and whatever, because it's its own individual piece. So you would have that. So the mute, and then of course on consoles they usually have like pre-fader listen or solo, a muting section, a routing section, and auxiliaries. But other than that, the main thing that you'll see in correlation to a piece of outboard gear would be the preamp section with some options like high pass, just like you would see on a channel strip on an actual outboard piece of gear, and then the EQ section if it has it, and then you got your master control output, master input control, master output control. Same thing on here, like on the Avalon, master input control with some options on the preamp section, master output section control. Now one thing that you'll notice on some consoles like SSLs and some consoles also give you dynamics like gates and compressors. Like these are compressors. These are a whole rack of compressors right here. Whole racks of compressors. A lot of consoles like this particular console don't have gates and compressors. So you have to insert it on a channel or a bus. But some channel strips give you that option too, like this one. This one also gives you some compression, and it also gives you some EQ. And one thing you'll notice, this right here is this particular one is just a preamp with just an EQ. This one is a compressor and has an EQ option. This one has a compressor and an EQ option. As an example, when you got channel strips, this one has a compressor and an EQ option. Same thing with this one. Same thing with this one. This also has a preamp section with a compressor section and an EQ section. Same thing here. You got an EQ and a compression section. Same thing with your preamp, and then you have a compression section. And so you get the idea. Some consoles don't, like this one don't have, it just have EQ. One thing that you will notice when you start having those, and I'm going to put this back up here. One thing about, so now you'll notice that when you're on a console, one thing you'll notice that you're always going to have a preamp section and at least an EQ section on every channel. And then you have the ability to auxiliary send those channels to different parts of the board or to bus assignments. On outboard gear, some outboard gear are just going to be preamps. Some are going to be preamps with EQs, and then some will be preamps, EQs, and compressors. And you'll notice, even if you look at an SSL channel strip, even if you have the plug-in, you'll notice that there's always EQ section or the preamp section, and sometimes it's just showing just the dynamic section, the EQ section, or sometimes it shows the EQ section and the dynamic section. But on a real SSL channel strip, it will have the EQ, it would have a preamp section, then it would go to the filtering section, then it would go to your dynamic section, then it would go to the EQ section, then it would go to your auxiliaries, your small faders, and then your large faders, your master volume outputs for that channel. So you got your gain inputs and then your master outputs, and then you have options. On channel strips, they gave you the same thing. They're going to allow you to go for the preamp and then allow you to engage the compressor. So you can go for the preamp, engage the compressor if you want to use the channel strips compressor. And then if you want to use the EQ section, you can engage it as well. And then you can go to your master output. Same thing, you can use your preamp section, you can engage your EQ. If this had a dynamics, you can engage your dynamics, EQs, or whatever. And then sometimes they'll allow you to reverse. So if I want to go from the preamp to the EQ, then to dynamics, or you can go the other way around and go from the preamp to your EQ, then your compressor, then your master output, master outputs, master inputs, master outputs. Like on outboard gear, there's just no faders. They don't have faders. They just have volume knobs. So that's the general breakdown of how outboard gear can correlate to what's happening on the console. So what's usually not on the console, you would have options in outboard gear. So next I'm going to talk about EQs, then I'm going to talk about compressors, and then I'm going to talk about the next, that's what I'm going to talk about. But that's lesson 1, to see how you can understand how this stuff correlates. Then I'll explain how it all works together. But that's going to do it. So I hope that makes sense. And what you're looking at when you're looking at a console or outboard gear, if that makes sense. I'll talk about delays and reverbs later, because those are effects versus dynamics and equalization and preamps. So first thing we want to talk about preamps, equalization, and compressors. All right. See you in the next video.